which kid is doing well, which one is behind, so that action can be taken immediately. We want to make sure that this growing gap between the best performing and the worst performing kids stops growing and contracts. You see, we have been spending more and more on schools, and yet the outcome has been getting worse. Now, money is important, but we have to make sure we get the right results, the right outcomes for our children, because they are our future.
And trust, Prime Minister, that was the question. Since 2007, the last Prime Minister to finish a full term was John Howard. So can both of you understand that the people of Australia actually want an answer to this question this evening? How can they trust you through the course of the next term?
My position in politics, the positions that I've taken in politics have been consistent over the years. I am a well-known quantity in Australian public life. I did not come into this role as a political activist. I did not come in here as a political staffer. I came into this role as an adult at 50, after a lifetime of working, building businesses in many, many areas, creating jobs, standing up for the enterprise of hard-working Australians that we all know is the foundation on which our future is based, and we are backing them. We are backing every one of them, the small businesses, the medium businesses, and in due course, all businesses.
Just briefly, Bill Short.
Australians can trust me to be consistent about a range of issues, taking real action on climate change. Australians can trust Labor not to support, under any circumstances, a 15% GST. Australians can trust Labor to always defend Medicare, especially against privatising any of the parts of Medicare. Australia can always trust Labor to make sure that working class and middle class families get a fair go from the workplaces to the schools, to making sure their kids get a fair crack at getting to university, not based upon their parents' wealth.
And trust that you'll still be there at the end of a term if things get hard?
Well, earlier on I did specifically answer Ellen's question. I said that the Labor Party had learnt from that difficult period, and we've demonstrated more unity of purpose than we have in a very long time. We've learnt our lesson.
Gentlemen, I put it to you both that neither of you have a medium-term health and education funding plan. You, Prime Minister, suggested that the states be given the power to levy their own income tax. Then you suddenly dropped that plan. You, Mr Shorten, you propose spending some of the $50 billion that the Prime Minister proposes spending on company tax cuts, which looks more like a spending plan than a funding plan. Why should voters believe either of you that you have a plan for health and education funding?
Well, Andrew, if I can address that, we have set out our commitment for both education funding and health funding. Indeed, at the last meeting with the premiers and the chief ministers, we agreed on a package for funding hospitals with an additional $2.9 billion. So our commitments are there, they're real, but you need to have strong economic growth to sustain that. We have to recognise that the commitments we have, whether it is in health, social welfare, in education, are enormous. They're an enormous claim on the budget, and the budget's strength, its revenue-raising capacity depends on having strong economic growth. Now, the Labor Party propose a series of measures which will stop and slow economic growth. We know that if you want more investment, you create tax incentives for investment. That's what we've just done with start-up companies. That's what we do with research and development. We have great concessions there to encourage it. The Labor Party is proposing to increase capital gains tax by 50%. It's going to block a cut in company tax to over 100,000 businesses that employ over 2 million Australians. These are all measures that Labor proposes which will slow economic growth. Everything we are proposing is driving economic growth, just as we drove economic growth with our export trade deals. Now, what we need is a plan, and we present that plan to ensure that we have strong growth, because without that, all of the promises, no matter how large, how extravagant, how generous, it doesn't matter. If you don't have economic growth, you can't pay for it. And this is what is missing in Labor's presentation. There is no plan for growth. There is not one measure that will deliver stronger economic growth or deliver more jobs. And every element of my plan will do just that.
Bill Shorten.
Mr Turnbull has the mother of all spending plans, and it's called a $50 billion tax giveaway to big business. It's not going to generate a whole lot of new investment and capital expenditure. How on earth does giving the 4 big banks in Australia a windfall of $7.4 billion over the next 10 years incentivise investment? No, Mr Turnbull wants to spend taxpayer money. He just doesn't want to spend it on most taxpayers. We do have a well-funded plan for healthcare. We will protect GPs and make sure that GPs are still able to offer bulk billing. We want to make sure it's your health, not your wealth, which determines your care in Australia. We have got a plan not to increase the price of medicine by $5 for prescriptions, and we have got a plan to properly fund our schools. Mr Turnbull airily dismisses the idea that more funding for schools is somehow not going to achieve results. The truth of the matter, Andrew, is that if you want to have economic growth in this country, have a skilled workforce. If you want to have an innovation nation that Mr Turnbull loves to talk about, you need to be an education nation. And when we go back to talk about Mr Turnbull's grand strategy, well, his latest grand strategy, after the 15% GST, after state income taxes, this proposal to give $50 billion in a ram rate on the Australian budget, to give it to companies over the next 10 years, even the government's own figures say that'll only generate 0.1% of GDP growth per year. It's good news for foreign shareholders. It's just not good news for people who depend upon Medicare and well-funded schools across Australia, in the regions and in the towns.
Since 2014, you've been complaining about the $80 billion that was cut from the budget. Some of that was in education, some was in health. $57 billion of that was in hospitals. So are you proposing that you will put all that money back because you've been complaining about it for 2 years, and how will you pay for it?
Well, when it comes to hospitals, Labor has been fighting the cuts of this government. When people see the waiting times in emergency wards blowing out, Labor will complain. When people have paid taxes their whole life, are waiting for knee reconstructions or hip replacements, and the waiting times are not just weeks but months and years, Labor will speak up for these people. We will announce our hospitals policy closer to the election. There is another 5 weeks to go of this marathon election.
Every dollar back, how will you explain what you've been saying for the last 2 years?
Well, first of all, Labor will always stand up for the people who are vulnerable in this society and people who want quality health care. When it comes to our hospitals policy, we're not going to announce our whole policy platform tonight, as much as it may be desired by some of the panellists. But what I can promise Australians right here, right now, is we will put more funding into hospitals than Mr Turnbull has promised by some significant dimension. Because we can afford
Just quickly,
to...
that significant dimension was $57 billion.
We can afford to do what I just said. Because we're not going to hand out $17 billion to the top 3% of income earners over the next 10 years. Because we will do budget repair that is fair. We will have rigid budget discipline. But we're not going to hand $50 billion to large companies who frankly are not going to, and reward them for old investment, and instead we're not going to gamble with our healthcare system and our school system in Australia. Absolutely we won't.
Laura Tinkle.
I've got questions for you both on company tax, which we've obviously had a fair discussion about already, and the budget. Mr Turnbull, dividend imputation does mean that most of the benefit of the company tax cut goes to foreign shareholders. Treasury's own modelling acknowledges other taxes will have to rise to fund the revenue hole it creates, and that it will create very few jobs. Why should we believe it will supercharge the economy? And Mr Shorten, does Labor have a ceiling on how much tax it thinks it should be collected as a proportion of the economy, given that you're advocating higher taxation? And is it correct that on your own figures, the budget bottom line will be worse over the next 4 years before some of your new tax measures kick in?
Well, Laura, let me speak to you about company tax and speak to you as somebody who has been in business most of their life and understands how business operates, understands how companies make investment decisions. If you want to have more of something, then you lower the tax on it. If you want to have more investment, then lower the tax on investment. If you want to have less of something, then increase the tax. Labor is proposing to increase the tax on investment. That will result in less investment, and if you have less investment, you will get less jobs. That is very straightforward. Now, as far as company tax is concerned, over the next 3 years, if we are returned to government, company tax will come down from 30% to 27.5% in the first year for companies with revenues up to $10 million, in the second year up to $50 million, and the third year up to $100 million. And then there'll be another election. And then over the long term, our plan will see company tax coming down to 25% for all companies. But over the next 3 years, the beneficiaries are going to be small and medium companies, almost all of which would be Australian-owned, and most of which, by numbers certainly, will be family-owned. Now, these companies employ millions of Australians. The companies up to $10 million in turnover employ 5 million Australians. And they will all benefit from that support because they will see more investment in their business. This is why other countries have reduced their company tax rate. Why has Britain reduced its company tax rate to 20%? They did that in order to drive economic growth and jobs, and it was successful. Our company tax rate is now the 7th highest in the OECD. Paul Keating reduced it. Paul Keating reduced it, a Labor treasurer. Peter Costello reduced it. Bill Shorten proposed reducing it last year. Chris Bowen wrote a book about reducing it. But now, of course, in this election, it is anathema to the Labor Party. They have no plan for economic growth and no plan for jobs. It's the same old Labor, just spending.
Bill Shorten.
Same old Liberals. Just give tax cuts to the top end of town and let the rest of the people just make do with not much at all. That's what I would say, Mr Turnbull. Now, in response to the 2 points which Laura raised, first of all on company taxation. The government's economic plan, remember, for 6 months they kicked around having a 15% GST and realised that that was electoral poison, so they're not going to talk about it this side of an election. Then Mr Turnbull declared famously at the Penrith Panthers Leagues Club that one of the great reforms to federation, the greatest since 1901, would be to allow states to levy a second income tax on Australians who go to work on top of a Commonwealth income tax. And now the government, having run out of Plan A and Plan B, has now gone to Plan C. Tax giveaways to the top end of town, which will spend $50 billion out of the budget. The election is about choices. We are not convinced that giving the largest banks in Australia $7.4 billion over the next 10 years is good for the budget, that it's good for Medicare, or that it's good for the nation. We are not convinced, and we've seen some of the evidence from the Australia Institute, that of this $50 billion, $11 billion, which Mr Turnbull's proposing to spend, that $11 billion of this will in fact go to American shareholders, or indeed the American taxman. That's not a plan. And indeed, as your question identified, all of the evidence has shown from Treasury, Mr Turnbull's own government department, that the impact on the economy will just be 0.1% improvement in GDP. Now and that's why we're not going to do it at this stage. Mr Turnbull says tax cuts are a lovely idea. The truth of the matter is, we need to get the budget repaired, because the real sweet spot of reform is to lower the marginal rates of taxation for working people. Mr Turnbull in his budget gave $17 billion back over the next 10 years to the top 3%. He gave $5 a week to people between $80,000 and $87,000 a week, and nothing for anyone under $80,000. By contrast, we recognise that just when you give a tax cut to a company, that a lot of these businesses Mr Turnbull's talking about will take that as income, which means they've still got to pay the higher income taxes. Dividend imputation mitigates against, in the Australian system, some of the international analogies which Mr Turnbull's using. Now, you asked me about Labor and what we would do over the... Sorry, Chris.
Sorry, just finish that point.
Laura asked us about Labor and what we would do over the 4 and 10-year period. I undertake that before this election campaign is over, we will provide all of our forecasts. Once we've released all of our policies, which we haven't yet, we will provide forecasts over 4 and 10 years. Our principle is that we will have more repairs to the budget bottom line than spends. We will have a credible path to balance, because we're committed to repairing the budget And let's never forget the deficit's tripled under the current government, but we're not going to do it in such a way that penalises people who want to see the doctor or parents who want the best start in life for their kids at the schools they send them to.
Can I just briefly...
The question, though, was, Mr Shorten, is there a ceiling of what you think where tax can go as a proportion of GDP? The Coalition has said 23.9%. You've advocated higher tax as part of the budget repair job. How high can tax go under Labor?
Well, we are determined to put downward pressure on taxes as a proportion of GDP. And we will provide all of our figures before the election campaign is concluded. But I have to say, the government spending under this government, the Liberals, now sees government spending as a proportion of GDP at global financial crisis levels at 25.8%. So whilst Mr Turnbull says he's against restraining government spending, the truth of the matter is that under the Liberals for the last 3 years, it's at global financial crisis levels, except there's no global financial crisis.
All right, just briefly to both of you, you've talked quite extensively, and we've seen it, your health and hospitals plan, and Prime Minister, you've talked quite extensively about the plan that you have in company tax cuts. Can you each agree this evening that at least on those things, and just very briefly, that the other side will have a mandate if it wins, so it doesn't have to deal with a Senate where nothing's going to go anywhere? Prime Minister?
Well, we will certainly support the commitments that we have made if we are returned to government. But as for the prospect of a Labor government, how would you know what they are going to do in government? I mean, and a few weeks ago, Labor said they were going to take every day to the election a promise, a pledge to roll back our abolition of the school kids bonus. They said they were going to reverse that. They got petitions signed, they had websites, they had mail-outs. They went out and spread that gospel right across the nation. That was their mission. And then on Thursday, Mr Shorten did a backflip. Uncluttered by any consultation with his shadow cabinet, he made that decision on the run. Now, how can you believe any promise that he has made?
So
how can you be sure that anything he pledges will be proposed in government?
So that's no? That's a no then?
The only focus that I have, Chris, is on delivering our national economic plan, and we are presenting that to the Australian people because we have a plan for economic growth and Mr Shorten does not.
Mr Shorten.
Well, I'm no clearer at the end of that answer than the start in terms of the answer to your question. There is a clear choice at this election.